What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? My friend told me about something that happened to her when she was younger, about 8 or 9. She was walking home from school and got her key out to let herself into the house. Her single mum worked and came home later on weekdays. As she reached up to put her key in the door, her mum opened it, in dressing gown, having left home sick. Instead of greeting her, she looked straight past my friend and immediately said, "Who are you?" My friend turned around and a man in a long coat hurried back down the path and down the street. Being ill that day had potentially saved her daughter from something potentially horrible happening to her. Very short one. Was talking to someone who was first on scene to the Virginia Tech massacre. He told me that, although the sight of dead bodies was disturbing, what really stays with him was the sound of all the cell phones ringing from people trying to contact them. That's incredibly sad to imagine. My uncle is a firefighter. He always has horrific tales to tell. One still sticks with me. He was first on the scene of a car accident. A log fell off a big transport truck and hit the car following it. The log sheared off the top of the car. Inside was a mom, dad, and child in the back seat. The child was lying down and sleeping when the accident happened. He awoke to the crashing of the car, only to see his parents' lifeless bodies still in their seats with no heads. That child will never be the same. Edit. I was told this as though it was true, but for all I know it could be a tale passed around firefighters. As some people pointed out, situations very similar to this one have occurred. He has told me other messed up things though, such as the misconception that bodies splatter when they leap from the window of a building. They actually bounce a little bit. Cannot unsee in my mind. I worked as a vet tech a couple of years ago, and this man came in to put down his old dog. Standard euthanasia protocol was used. Get a basic history. Ask if they want to be present, etc. As a coworker of mine asked the "do you want to be present" part, he responded with yes, because I lost both of my boys last week and I wasn't there for them, and I'll be damned if I'm not there to send off my last living family member. Apostrophe. Both of his boys we later found out died overseas. After hearing this, our whole staff went into our euthanasia room and just hugged this man and his dog several minutes past his dog moving on. Out of my years in the field, I've never heard such a heartbroken man to lose his animal. When I was 13, my dad was taken to hospital and my mother joined him, leaving me in the house alone sleeping. When they came back they noticed handprint on all the downstairs windows of the house and snow trodden in the porch. They searched the house and nobody was there. The next day we find out our next door neighbor was murdered. I know it's not that scary, but when I think how close I came to possibly being murdered, or worse, it sends chills down my spine. My grandfather's second wife was a sleepwalker, the kind that would get out of bed and do things like make a sandwich in the kitchen. My grandfather became used to it, and whenever he woke up in the middle of the night and she wasn't in bed beside him, he would find her and gently lead her back to bed without waking her up, just as he had been advised. But one night he wakes up and she isn't lying in bed, but instead sitting on the edge of the bed, her back turned to him. He calls her name to ask what's wrong, but she doesn't answer, and he realizes she must be asleep. He can tell that she's doing something, holding something in her lap, but he can't see what it is. He sits up, looks over her shoulder, and sees what she's doing, still in her sleep, loading his revolver. When I was maybe 4 and my sister was almost 1, my parents had been divorced a few months, and my mother was driving us from Las Vegas to Wichita to see our grandparents. At one gas station on the way, this man came up to the car and told my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone, and I noticed we are headed in the same direction. Do you want me to follow you for a while to make sure you are safe?" She politely said, "No thanks," and drove off. At our next stop for gas, he again came up under the guise of checking on us. He had been following us since the last stop. While he was talking to my mother, his sport coat blew open, and I saw a gun tucked in his pants. After she again told the man we were fine, she left and I told her what I saw. While she was driving, she wrote a note to give to the next gas station attendant saying who we were, where we were planning on spending the night, and that this creepy dude was following us and what he looked like. "Could you please call the law in I don't remember what town it was, and have them waiting at the hotel. When we got to the next stop, Mom raced in and handed the clerk the note and sped off with us. We got to the hotel and the manager had the cops waiting in one room and gave us another room with a pizza and pop. The man showed up and asked if his wife and kids had checked in yet and what room were they in. The manager gave him the key to the one with the police in it. They questioned him and found out he was a convicted rapist and also had a warrant out. So he was arrested. Smart mom. 1 rapist. 0. When Chinese flag bearer and basketball phenom Yao Ming walked through the national stadium during the opening ceremony of the Olympics, there was so much commotion where I was that I neglected to find out more about the little boy was that he was walking with. It was Lin Hao, a 9-year-old who survived the deadly earthquake in Sichuan in May. It's interesting how this tribute to the earthquake by opening ceremony director Zhang Yimou has been covered by the international press. Many Western news outlets reported that Lin was an earthquake survivor, but they failed to mention that the little boy, who was attending the Uzixi Primary School in quake epicenter Wenchuan County, not only survived, but after getting out of his classroom, went back into the rubble to pull 2 classmates out to safety. During his rescue, he was hit by falling rubble and suffered injuries on his head and arms. It's also been reported that while his classmates, 10 survivors out of 32 students, were waiting for help, he encouraged them to sing songs to keep their spirits up. When he was asked why he risked his life, he said, "I was the hall monitor. It was my job to look after my classmates." Apostrophe. A friend of mine was a bike messenger in Chicago. He was rowdy even for that line of work, known to kick cars that cut him off and the like. He apparently got into a confrontation with someone in Ansuv about 10 years ago. The driver literally runs him down and plows right over him. The guy drove off and nobody managed to get the license plate number or a good description of the vehicle or the driver. The EMTs roll my dead friend over and he's cradling the guy's front plate in both arms like a football. I got chills even writing it. Damn dude, even when he was dying he wanted to make sure that asshole got caught. When I was in elementary school, a student at my school was involved in a triple homicide suicide. His father murdered his mother, his brother, then him, then finally himself. For a while after that I imagined being in that house during that event. It happened in the middle of the night while they were sleeping, according to the news story. But I know that after the first murder everyone in that house was awake. Everyone you knew and spent your entire life with is being killed all around you by someone you looked up to, and you have nowhere to go. It's extremely terrifying to me. The child was like 10 or 11. Very sad. What makes it worse is that in high school, the exact same scenario happened again in my city. I don't think the child was at my school, but the house it happened in was within a mile from my house. Pretty crazy stuff. Edit. Both happened in southern Arizona. I'm sure it has happened elsewhere too. Went to high school with a kid who was present when his father shot his mother and then shot himself. He didn't come back to school again. My grandma during WW2 used to steal potatoes and coal from Nazis for her family. She was young, between 12 and 16, I'm not sure. One day she noticed a few men standing near a fencer, but paid them no mind, since she had just stolen coal and potatoes. This happened for a few weeks, her taking the same route, and she noticed the men getting frail and weak, so she snuck back later that evening and gave them some food, and continued to for a while, ended up saving their lives, and that is how my grandmother met my grandfather, who was a Russian soldier being held prisoner. Camp was possibly Breendank, but I'm not sure. She passed a few years ago, so I can't ask. On a side note, on her deathbed the priest asked my grandmom what she wanted to be known as, and she said a thief, because of this story. The part about your grandmom saying she wanted to be known as a thief is the best. Amazing. My mom was a city housing manager. I remember her telling me about a little boy who had peed his pants at Chuck E. Cheese. His parents had taken him home, gave him a bath, and while his mother scrubbed him raw, his father kept turning the water hotter and hotter. The poor boy was burned and scared all over his body. I believe he was 4 at the time. I have heard many horrible stories in my lifetime, but this one still makes me shudder. 2 years ago in 6 days I was in a car wreck and almost died. I was driving home late at night fell asleep at the wheel and slammed into a tree on my driver's side front door. I have no memory of what happened for the next couple of days. But I woke up in the ICU strapped to a bed with a respirator and feeding tube in me. I had broken bones in my skull, my collarbone, collapsed both lungs, and ruptured my diaphragm. Every doctor I have seen since then looks at me in shock and tells me I shouldn't be here. The chilling part of the story is how I was found. Some neighbors of mine were driving home late from dropping their daughter off at a bus that she was taking to camp where she was a counselor. The bus left late. It was delayed because another couple counselors were an hour and a half late. One of them was my best friend from elementary school. After they finally dropped their daughter off, they headed home and were driving down a secluded road near our neighborhood. The wife saw a car parked on the wrong side of the road, but couldn't that there was any damage because it was dark and on the opposite side of the car. They kept driving until she thought she heard honking and convinced her husband to turn around. I was unconscious. The car was dead and the horn was found to not be working later. They didn't know it was me until 2 days later. They saved my life. I was 16/17, and it was very common for my friends and I to go camping in the mountains. Bring weed, beer, acid, whatever. I was always a big fraidy cat when it came to getting ducked up, so I usually abstained. Parents' warnings took to heart, I guess. This particular night most of my friends were tripping acid, while I was sipping a beer, enjoying the fire and whatnot, and a bunch of us girls decided to go off somewhere to pee. We were still pretty young and quite squeamish about the boys seeing us squat. Hell, I still am. We stumble off into the woods and end up walking for quite some time. One girl was searching for the perfect spot, and she was super high, but we all just went along. We finally come to a small clearing and decide to pee there. Everyone pees and we set off back to camp. One of my friends hears a low moan coming from the other side of the clearing. Tells us to shhh. But we don't hear it, so we urge her to come on. She is intent on investigating, so I decide to go with her. It was really dark out. You could only see as far as the lantern's light hit. So we were off into the unknown. Our light finally revealed a car, a brand new looking Subaru. It was really sudden like, and kinda freaked us out, so we scamper back to our friends screeching like lil 16/17 yo girls and set off back to our camp all freaked out. We tell the boys about it when we get there, and they convince us we had happened upon another campsite and make fun of us for freaking out. 5 years later, I'm in nursing school and working as an admin assistant in a labor and delivery hospital. I have made a really good friend at work and she and I hang out all the time. One night she comes over and we are drinking and she tells me her dad has been missing since he was in high school. She says he had tried to commit suicide a few times and her family figured that he succeeded, but no one ever found him. She secretly was hoping he just ran off to start a new life and maybe she would see him again someday. Not very long after that, a man was found in a stolen Subaru up on the mound where we used to camp. He had been there for years, through every season. Freezing to hot. There was a hose from the tailpipe to the window. The man had committed suicide. It made the news, and one of the guys from high school called and reminded me of that night in the woods. The car was found not far from our usual spot. Wasn't that nuts? That was what we saw at work. My friend got a call from her mother. The guy in the car was her dad. We heard him moaning. We saw the car. If we weren't such dumb shit little kids we could have done something. I watched my friend fall apart over it, but didn't tell her about my experience in the woods. I have always felt so bad. Probably the story about the girl that got lost in the Odessa catacombs back in 2005. I can only imagine that grim realization that you are lost and alone in a giant series of tunnels. Eventually the battery on your phone gives out and you're in complete darkness feeling along the cold damp walls. An eerie silence surrounds you, broken only by your footfalls and sobs. You have no company but your fears, regrets, and the question of how you came to this when only a few hours prior you were drunkenly partying with friends. One day bleeds into the next and your calls into the darkness go unanswered. Your hope of rescue begins to wane. No one is listening to your prayers. You're parched, scared, hungry, tired, and you slowly realize that this is where you're going to die. You choke on every bit of your existence. You've gone through the anger, the denial, the bargaining, but now you're too tired, too dizzy, and your head won't stop throbbing. Eventually you collapse from dehydration and your body isn't found for another 2 years. A woman I dated who went to school in Missouri had some friends who went cave diving a lot. While diving one day, their line fell from the ceiling, as she put it, and they were lost. She said when their bodies were recovered, it was apparent they'd fought over the last of the air in their tanks. When I was in my early teens, my parents used to go out dancing and left me alone on Friday nights. We lived in a rustic, soporific house, surrounded only by a desolate sawmill and a defunct car garage. The closest neighbor was about a mile away. I used this opportunity to throw heavy metal albums in their fantastic stereo and play them at an enormous volume. One evening, I put in Metallica's And Justice for All and went to the restroom in a small corner in the house. Blackened was blaring in the distance, and it seemed as if the floor was shaking. I walked back into the living room and looked at the front door, and I could see the chain on the door pulsating in rapid rhythms. I remember thinking the bass on this system is incredible. Then, during the middle of the song, the chain stopped moving. Please subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more of Reddit Universe.